Chapter 4. The Pin. In example 1, it's good to imagine that it's a white's turn to move, and imagine putting the rook here on b5. From here, the rook pins the black bishop to the black king. Now, the bishop cannot move because it would expose the king, and that is illegal. Now, since the bishop cannot move, and there's nothing black can do to defend the bishop, no matter what black does on the next move, white will capture the bishop. And that is the basic pattern of the pin that we're going to be working through in this chapter. In example 2, we also have a pin. This time it's the white bishop pinning the black rook to the black king. So the rook cannot move. Now, the tempting move for a beginner is to simply take the rook. But actually, after the king recaptures, this is actually a drawn position with correct play, despite white's extra pawn, because of the active placement of the black king. Instead, Chernev and Seinfeld introduced the concept of hitting the piece while it's down. This immobile rook, which cannot move, is much better off being hit again from the white perspective rather than just captured. And how can we hit that piece again? Well, we can play e3 and attack it with the pawn. Now, black has to make a move. He can't move the immobilized pinned rook. So the only other piece on the board is his king. He has to move it. And now we can capture the rook. And you'll see that the black king cannot take the bishop because the bishop's guarded by the pawn. And he also can't take the pawn because the pawn is guarded by the bishop. So now white has an advantage of material that is absolutely more than sufficient to win the entire game. And as this game goes on, white will be able to get another queen and win the game. In example 3, we once again have a pinned piece. Can you spot the pinned piece here? It's white's turn to move. The pinned piece is black's knight. It cannot move, for if it does, it will expose the black rook in the corner. So since this piece is immobilized for all intents and purposes, Chernev and Seinfeld again prescribe the same mode of action, and that is intensifying the amount of force that we apply to the pinned piece, kicking the pinned piece while it's down. Now, how can we do that this time? How can we concentrate further pressure onto this pinned piece? We're already attacking it once. How can we attack it a second time? Well, the answer is bishop f4. From f4, the bishop also contributes to the attack on the knight, and now no matter what black does next, we're either going to win the knight, or if the knight moves away, we'll win the rook behind it. So let's say black plays a5, we win the knight. And in this example, let's say black acquiesces to the trade of rooks as well, and look at this ending position, where white has not only more pawns on the board, but also an extra bishop, and this will be an easy win for the white team. In this example, black is actually threatening checkmate on f2. So white is in quite a dire situation and has to come up with something right now to prevent the checkmate on f2. Now, the queen is unable to get over to a square where it can assist in the defense of f2. And the rook also cannot come up to, say, h2, where it defends f2, because there it would simply be captured and the threat of the f2 checkmate would still exist. Now, how is this situation going to be remedied for white? I would encourage you to take some time and think about this for yourself, but for the purposes of keeping the flow going, let's look at a particular feature of this position, and that is the alignment of the black king and the black queen on the same line. Whenever you see any two pieces on the same line, that should be a trigger for you to think about potentially bringing about conditions favorable for a pin. In this scenario, it would be a pin if we could just play, say, rook to g1. If only this pawn wasn't in the way. If that pawn wasn't there at all, then rook g1 would be a pin and we would be actually winning the queen. Now, that in and of itself is enough of an observation to turn this dire situation from white into a very good situation. The very violent move, rook takes g7 check, seemingly sacrificing the rook for a pawn, is the correct answer. Now, if the king simply steps away, say for example to f8, and then we just take the queen, and we're absolutely winning here. Otherwise, either the king or the queen has to take the rook. In either case, they will be aligned, and the rook g1 pin works. And the best the queen can do is give itself up for the rook, after which white is the one in the winning position. In this example, the white king and queen are once again aligned, this time on a diagonal, and this alerts us to the potential of a pin from our dark squared bishop here on the c5 square. The only reason we can't play that move immediately is because the knight here guards the c5 square. And from that observation, we come up with the move a4 to push this knight away, and once the knight moves, leaving this square undefended, we can play bishop c5, guarded by our rook, and we're going to win that queen. In this example, again, we see pieces lined up with each other. Here, it's the knight and the bishop and the king all on the same line, and we are potentially in a pinning position here with our queen. How do we add more pressure to these pieces? It's with this pawn on h5. We can advance that pawn to h4, kicking the knight away, and once the knight moves, we can advance the pawn again. Now, the bishop does not have the same luxury as what the knight had, because the bishop is strictly pinned to the king, cannot move. Here, white can play a counter-attacking move, attacking our queen, but all we have to do is keep it on the same line and in a square where it's still safe. Note that if we had instead brought it down to here, it could be captured by white's queen, and then our pin would be gone. And of course, if we move it to here, it will be captured by the knight. So this is the correct square that maintains the pin. And now the loss of the bishop is inevitable. White plays knight g3. We can take the bishop, and the game goes on from here, but we've favorably traded just a measly pawn for white's bishop. This position is a fascinating one to ponder, and I would strongly urge you to do that for a while. What you see is that the white bishop is pinning the dark knight to the black king, which means that this knight cannot move. It also means that the king can't move away from the knight without losing the knight, and with it, the game. Because of that, black is desperately wanting to unpin the knight from the king, and there's only really one way to do that, seeing as the e-pawn cannot move away. If the e-pawn wasn't there, then the king could take a step to the left onto e6. From there, it would still guard the knight, but the pin would be broken and the knight could jump away. Well, that's not possible with this pawn here, and since the pawn can't move forward, there's nothing to see here. Instead, the only other way for the king to move whilst maintaining contact with the knight and breaking the pin would be to play the move f4. And once f4 is played, then the king can step forward to f5, maintaining contact with the knight, but breaking the pin. That's from that observation we realize we do not want to allow black to play f4. Now, there's really no way we can prevent black from playing f4. Even if we play g3, he can still play f4. And in fact, these are the first moves of the solution to this puzzle. But the real solution lies in the fact that even after we've now done this, played g3 and he plays f4, the secret is we want to keep the black king out of this square here, out of f5. So the way to do that is by then pushing our pawn once more to g4. Now we have again said to the king, you cannot use this square, you can only use these squares, and if you use any of them, we're going to capture the knight. From here, it's a matter of waiting for black to run out of other moves. Black can move this pawn, black can move this pawn, and black can move this pawn, but eventually black's going to run out of pawn moves, and then we'll have to move this king to one of these squares. No matter which one he chooses, we're going to win the knight. And let's see how this works in practice. Let's say black tries to do away with our pawn here. We certainly don't take the pawn. No. Instead we play h3, saying, if you take our pawn, we're just going to put another pawn there, and we're always going to control this square here. Now black, let's say they advance that pawn. What do we need to do? We need to wait. We need to wait until black runs out of pawn moves. So let's say we play king f2. Now, black can't move this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, or this pawn. So he's either got to move this one or this one. Let's say he moves his f-pawn. It's our move again. We don't want to give him this pawn for free by pushing this and allowing him to take. So instead, we can make a waiting move with our bishop, keeping it on the same diagonal so as to maintain the pin against the knight. So let's say we play bishop d4. Now it's black's moves again. Black cannot move this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, or this pawn, cannot move the knight, doesn't want to move the king because it will lose the knight, so therefore he moves his pawn. Once again, we make a waiting move with our bishop on the same line to maintain the pin, forcing black to make another move. This one is his last one with the pawn, is to give us a pawn for free, so we take it. In so doing, we give him one more pawn move, which he makes, and we take that one too, thank you very much, and now black is out of pawn moves and has to move his king, leaving his knight unguarded. We capture it. We have two connected outside pass pawns on the side of the board. We've got an extra bishop. We're about to win the f3 pawn, and it's just an absolutely devastatingly overwhelming position, and a very fascinating one at that. This position is actually meant to be seen from the black side. And here what we see is the white queen overloaded. Overloaded because it needs to defend the rook, and it also needs to defend this square. Not only the pawn, but the square. Note that if the queen lands on this square, like this, it would actually be checkmate because the queen is supported by our bishop. It's checkmate except for the fact that white can recapture. Now, however, the white queen is no longer able to defend the white rook because the queen is pinned by the bishop. It can't move away this way. So if black takes the rook, white cannot play this move. That's illegal. That would uncover the king to the attack from the black bishop. Instead, the best that white can do is take the bishop, at which point black has an overwhelming material advantage. And let's see this one once again from the start. The correct move here is queen takes pawn. This brings about a situation where the white rook is actually undefended. It looks defended, but it's not. We can take it, and we have a winning position. In this position, you'll see that once again, the queen and the king are lined up, and we are pinning the queen to the king. And what is the normal prescription for how we win once we've put in place a pin? Well, we win by concentrating force on the pinned piece, by kicking the immobilized piece while it's down. In this scenario, how can we add further pressure to the pinned piece? Well, rook d1. Now, black can actually take our queen. That is a legal move. However, rather than just simply recapturing the queen, which would be a blunder, what we do is we insert rook takes rook, check, forcing black to move the king, and only then do we recapture the queen. In this version, we end up with a full extra rook, and we're absolutely going to win. In this position, it is white to move, and have a look around for what sort of moves you might like to play here. One quite obvious move is rook h7 check, and this turns out to be a wonderful move. Black really cannot block the check with his rook, because then we would easily be able to take that rook and continue our attack. Instead, he moves his king back. Now you'll note the king and the queen are on the same line. It's the same diagonal. And how do we want to respond here? Well, we put our light squared bishop on that diagonal, pinning the queen to the king. In this case, black plays bishop d6. We take the queen, and after he recaptures, we take the pawn with check, leaving the king with only one square, after which we deliver checkmate. Now, in this position, we're going to bring about a pin. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do it by using a violent move, as always. And the violent move here is rook takes bishop. Now, after rook takes bishop, king takes rook is not a legal move because the rook is defended by the other rook. So if he wants to take back, he has to do it with the other rook. And now we see that the rook and the king are lined up on the white diagonal, and we can put our light squared bishop on that diagonal, pinning that rook, which we now attack twice. And he has no way to defend that rook again. So he can take our pawn, but then we get to take the rook. And we are up a large amount of material. Now, this is a very similar example, and the repetition of similar themes is part of the greatness of this book. Let's see now again how we're going to bring about this pin and then exploit it. We are black, and we're going to play the violent move, rook takes bishop. Once again, the king cannot take the rook because it's guarded by the bishop. So if he wants to take back, and of course he must, else he just loses a bishop for free, he has to do it with his rook. But his rook is now pinned by our bishop to his king, and his rook cannot move. What's the prescription once we've pinned a piece? I'm sure you're getting the hang of this now with all this repetition. We want to kick that piece while it's down. We want to concentrate force against that pinned piece. And how can we concentrate force against that piece? Well, step one here is rook to d8, adding another attacker to the piece. Now white brings their own rook to d1, adding another defender to the piece. And how do we continue from here? Well, we have a pawn. We just need to push it up a little while so that it can participate in the attack as well. So let's push that pawn. White, not wanting to sit around, plays g3, counterattacking our bishop. Well, that's fine. Our bishop's not really participating in the current attack, but we don't just want to give it up. So let's drop it back to safety. And now we're threatening to continue on. We're threatening to push this piece forward, this pawn forward, with a fork that also adds extra pressure to the pinned piece. So white actually takes that pawn. Now we take back. Now that in and of itself is a win for us. We've just won a knight for a pawn. The pin here still exists, and we're still threatening to push this pawn forward. To prevent that, white plays f3. So now we can't really push this pawn forward because he would simply take it. Instead, the time has come to cash in. We take his rook. If he wants to recapture, it has to be with his rook. Now we recapture his rook again, and he takes us. And in this resulting position, we want to activate our king, and you can see that the pawns are relatively equal, but we've got an extra bishop here. And we are going to be able to win the game with that overwhelming material advantage. This position is another very interesting position because, again, we have to bring about the pin. It doesn't yet exist on the board. We have to creatively search for it. And the way to do that in this case is to actually disconnect and discoordinate black's rooks. We do that by playing the violent move, bishop takes knight. This forces the recapture, rook takes bishop. But you'll note now that this rook is undefended. It's no longer defended by its mate as it was before. So we can continue now with d takes e5. Now, this pawn cannot recapture because that would allow our rook to take his rook, free of charge. So instead he plays the f pawn to recapture. And now, again, we see the power of the pin. This pawn is pinned. It's not really protecting this pawn. So we play knight takes e5, attacking the rook and also having just won a pawn. In the example here, he takes the knight, and that allows us to see the power of our pin. We now get to take a rook. And that's a beautiful example as well. In this example, again, we're going to see how to bring about the conditions for a pin. No pin yet exists, but what we do have is a queen-bishop battery pointing towards the h2 pawn. Now, we can start with that move, and that's a check. Since the king can't capture us, he has to step onto one of these light squares. Once he does that, you'll note that the king and queen are aligned on the light square diagonal, and we therefore have the ability to pin that queen to the king using our light squared bishop. Bishop c6. Now, the variation does not end there because white can also give us some resistance. White plays bishop d4, and the effect of this move is to uncover the bishop, the rook, so that when our bishop moves, taking his queen with check, his rook is attacking our queen. However, because we've taken with check, he has to first attend to the check, and he does that by taking our bishop. Now, it's quite a simple matter. We take his rook, and even though he takes our queen back, we take a second rook, which is a good trade for us. In this scenario, even though he's attacking our bishop, we're attacking his bishop. So if he saves his bishop, we might have an instinct to save our own bishop, but instead we can do something better, because if we simply save our bishop, he's going to actually take our rook. So what we need to do is move our rook to this square where it attacks his other bishop. Now, he moves that bishop away. Now he actually is threatening our bishop. So we bring our bishop to safety. But here he inserts another move. He takes this pawn and attacks our rook. So we don't just want to take the bishop because he'll take our rook. Instead, we take this pawn, and now we're attacking this bishop. We're also attacking this bishop. And as the dust has settled, we've come out a long way ahead on material, and we're going to end up winning. Again, to look at this rather long and complex example, the point was really the check drew the king and queen onto the same diagonal so that we could pin the queen to the king, take that queen with check, forcing him to recapture, then trade our queen for two rooks, and then carefully consolidate our advantage in the ensuing play. This position is a very, very interesting one. It's white to move, and your first instinct might be to bring the queen close to the black king by playing something like queen h6 check. Of course, the bishop cannot just retreat, because if it does, we're going to eat that bishop with our queen, and that would actually be checkmate. So black's not going to do that. Instead, black's going to move the king. But once they move the king, the question is, how do we actually proceed? We cannot play checkmate because, well, this bishop's going to eat our queen. Nor can we play checkmate because if we play this, then the queen is going to capture our queen. So the best we can really do is come back to g5, at which point, again, he's not just going to give us this bishop for free or this queen for free. He's going to move his king back, and we are once again in the starting position. What we've learned so far is that coming to h6 really didn't help. The question is, how can we proceed here in an advantageous manner? And the answer is nothing short of ingenious. We actually play queen h4 check. Now again, the king is forced to g8 for the same reasons as before. He's not able to put the bishop there. We would just eat it with our queen, and that would be checkmate. And he has no other squares he can move to. So he goes g8. Now we go queen g3 check. Once again, he can't block with the bishop. That's completely futile. He can't block with the queen, also futile. Instead, he simply has to move back to h8. And now you will see that his king and queen are aligned on the same diagonal, and our queen is now in a position where it can support a bishop landing on c3, pinning that queen to the king. The best he can do now is take the bishop, and after we recapture, he's got nothing better than to interject a few little moves, giving us free pieces. Eventually, he's going to have to move his king to g8, and there we have the checkmate. Once again, let's see this one from the beginning. The correct answer is check, he has to move. Check, he has to move, and now we can pin him because his queen and king are aligned on that diagonal. And after a few meaningless interjections, we deliver mate. This is another beautiful example because, again, it shows us that we can bring about pins, or we can bring about ways to increase pressure on pieces that already are pinned. Now, in this example, the black bishop is pinned to the queen and the king. So the rook here is doing a great job of pinning this bishop, and we would just love to be able to increase the pressure on this bishop. If only we could. Our pawns are immobilized, so they can't move forward. Our queen can't really get over there anytime soon, nor can our knight, nor can our other rook. But by considering the violent moves, remember the methodical thinking that Purdy said was so important in chess, more important than creative inspiration? Let's consider those violent moves. What happens if we play rook takes rook? Well, he's not just going to give us the rook for free, he's going to take our rook back. But, now our pawn is actually free to advance, adding extra pressure to the pinned piece, kicking this immobile piece while it's down, and concentrating force against the piece. Now, let's say the bishop acquiesces and takes the pawn. Well, then we take the queen with our rook, and then infiltrate with our queen, and we're absolutely winning here. We won the queen for a rook. If instead he goes for a queen trade first, that's fine. We just take back, and the bishop is still pinned. Very, very, very powerfully. There's no way for him to save that bishop. So let's say he plays h5. We can then take that bishop, and we're now threatening to get a queen, which would also come with a discovered check. So let's say he moves the king out of the way. Well, we can't quite get the queen because his rook's defending that square, But what we can do now is just play our knight up to c6, where it defends this square, also happens to defend our rook. We're going to get a queen. We're absolutely winning this position. And a few moves ago, it seemed like, although we had a pin, it didn't seem there was much we could do until we considered in a methodical fashion the violent moves, starting with checks and captures. Since we have no checks, we looked at captures. We looked at rook takes rook, and that allowed us to concentrate force on the pinned piece, and no matter what he did, we ended up with a winning position as a result. This position again shows pins and how we create them. And we do it by looking at violent moves. First move here is knight takes bishop. This forces the reply rook takes knight, which has the effect of disconnecting the rooks and also allows us to make the following follow-up. Bishop takes knight. Now, he can recapture in one of two ways, either with the pawn or with the rook. In either case, let's say he takes with the pawn, we can then now apply more pressure to this pinned piece, because this bishop here is in fact pinned by our rook to his rook. It can't move. So we're going to concentrate more force now on this pinned piece, and the way we're going to do that is with b6, the pawn move. Now, there's not much he can do to stop, in fact, nothing he can do to stop us from winning that bishop. And after the trade of rooks, he can take the pawn, and we are in a winning position. We activate our other rook, and if he moves off the file, then we are going to own the open C file, which is fantastic. Also, pop quiz, if he did come to this square, what move would be the best move to play? Note that his king and rook would be on this dark squared diagonal. We would want to play bishop to a3 in this example, pinning this rook. But that's besides the point. The main idea here is, by force, we captured a bishop, forcing a recapture, captured a knight, forcing a recapture, so that we could then add pressure to this pinned piece. And then we won it. In this position, we don't yet have any pinned pieces available to us, but with a single move, we will be able to both create a pinned piece and add pressure to it. This is somewhat of a discovered attack, which is another sort of technique we will learn later on in the book, but inevitably combinations and combinative ideas that draw from different weaponry and bring them together is what you see in winning chess. So the move is bishop c5. Why is this move so good? Well, by moving the bishop, we actually uncover the effect of our rook. And what is the effect of our rook? The effect of our rook is to pin the white bishop to the white queen. This bishop can no longer move. If it moves, even say to take our bishop, then our rook on e8 is going to win the queen on e2. So we've uncovered the rook. Also, by placing our bishop here on c5, we've added pressure to the pinned piece. So we are threatening to win this piece right now. And there's not a lot that white can do about it. Turns out the best move is actually to sacrifice the exchange, to give up the rook for a bishop. So white takes the bishop. We then recapture with our queen. And here, yes, white can take our queen, but then we take the white queen. And we're still up an exchange there. Remember, we've just won an exchange. We traded our bishop for white's rook. That means we've won an exchange. So even that is a good scenario for us. But in this example, white tries to continue to defend the bishop, and that also is fine for us because, as mentioned, we've won an exchange. We've both got queens and a single rook, but we have a rook instead of a bishop. We're an exchange up in this example, and black is winning from here. This is a wonderful example as well, which also demonstrates how to bring about a pin with devastating effect. Of course, the way to do that, thinking methodically, is through the violent moves. In particular, the violent move that we're going to play here is knight takes pawn. The effect of this is, firstly, to win a pawn, and secondly, it comes with a tempo against this black rook. So, really, black has to take the pawn, has to take our knight. And we follow up with another very violent move. Rook takes bishop. Now, black cannot just let us take the bishop. He's going to take back. And now we see the whole point of both of these moves. The whole point of these moves was to get the king and the queen onto the same diagonal. Now, we can actually play bishop takes d5, where it's supported by our rook, and it pins the queen to the king, and we're going to win that queen. Let's look at that again. We note that there is potential through the x-ray of this rook and this bishop. There is potential to land a pin on this diagonal if we have multiple trades on this square. And we start with knight takes pawn, hitting the rook. After the bishop recaptures, we continue with rook takes bishop, forcing the queen onto the diagonal of choice, and then we pin that queen to the king, and we win the queen. This example is another lovely example. This one has a focus also on the order of operations. We start with queen f3 check. Now, the king can't move away either to the left or the right without simply losing the bishop with another check. So, instead of moving the king away, white retreats the bishop. And the question now becomes, what do we do to proceed? We notice that this bishop is pinned. It cannot move because it's pinned to the king. How can we add pressure to this pinned piece? You might note that we've got a knight here. But if we simply play the knight around, adding pressure to the pinned piece and threatening checkmate, well, then we actually will lose the game because we've lost sight of what our opponent's threats are. And our opponent's threat also includes taking our rook with check, forcing the retreat of our queen, and then taking our queen with checkmate. Hence, order of operations is important. We give the check, the bishop drops back. The bishop is pinned. We're trying to add pressure to the pinned piece. How can we do that? If not by knight g4, well, we can use our rook f8. This beautiful move adds the threat of checkmate, and even though it leaves our knight attacked and stranded, if in fact white were to take that knight, we would end the game with checkmate. So therefore, after rook f8, white has to do something different. They have to defend this bishop, and the only real way to do that is queen c5, defending the bishop, also maintaining an attack on our knight. And now the time has come to play knight g4, adding a third and final attacker to this piece, which can now no longer be defended. On the next move, we will win the piece. Now, it's also interesting to note, although it wasn't originally examined in Chernev and Reinfeld's book, that it does matter. It matters very much how we take this piece. The correct method is to take it with the knight, at which point White's best move is to take our rook. When we recapture, he will come up with a pin of his own. His rook now pins our knight to our queen. If our knight moves away, he will actually take our queen with checkmate. But for one important detail, and that important detail is, well, what if our knight moves to h3? Check. The priority of check. There is now no ability for White to take our queen, because White has to deal with the check by first moving his own king. At this point, if it were me, I would trade my queen for the rook and then just play this endgame with an additional knight on the board. Very easy. But a very nice example. Check and how we have to carefully add pressure to the pinned piece. And even when we take the piece, we have to do it carefully. Careful of such details as a counter pin, and to make sure we have an escape route, which may often come only in the form of giving a check to buy ourselves time to escape properly. This position is another very nice position because we're going to bring about a pin. At the moment, we can see that the rook and the queen are lined up on the same diagonal, and our queen has the potential to be pinning this rook. The only reason it's not a real pin at the moment is because the queen here is actually defended by the knight on c6. From that observation, we get the move bishop takes knight, which forces the recapture of pawn takes bishop. Now, this rook really is pinned. If it moves away, our queen is going to capture the black queen. Now, what's the prescription once we've pinned a piece like this? We want to concentrate force on that piece and kick it while it's down. How do we do that here? Well, we play rook c2, adding extra strength of attack against this piece. Now, black's not just going to sit around, they're going to try and defend their piece, so they play the other rook to d8, lending support to this piece. And we need to attack this piece again. How can we do that? Bishop c1. And now it's a lost cause for black. We're going to win that piece. In this example, white has just played the move h3, attacking our bishop. And there is a temptation that if we just move to simply move the bishop back. But we note that if we just move our bishop back, then our poor knight over here on h5 is going to be eaten by his knight. So we don't want to allow that. Therefore, there's a temptation just to initiate a bunch of trades. For example, bishop takes knight, and after queen recaptures, we take his knight and he takes ours, and we maintain this rather equal position. But there is something a lot better, and it stems from this pin that our bishop is exerting upon the pawn on f2. By pinning it to the king, it means that this knight on g3 is actually undefended. And therefore, the correct move is to take that knight. Once we've taken the knight, yes, white can capture our bishop, and that's a relatively equal trade, knight for bishop. But we then get to follow up by winning the exchange. We get to take the rook for the knight. So rather than just playing in a very equal manner like this, no. Instead, we exert this pin, we manifest its power by taking the knight and then the rook after it. In this position, again, we see the power of a pin exerted from a long-range bishop. This is one of the reasons why bishops are generally considered to be slightly superior to knights, and that is their long-range capacities. Of course, it's also considered, and accurately so, that it always depends on the situation at hand whether a knight or a bishop is better. But in this case, the bishop on b3 is exerting a pin against this pawn on f7. This pawn cannot move, so the g6 square is actually undefended, which means we can play the simple move knight g6, attacking the queen, which is smothered by its own pieces and has nowhere to go, and in doing so, we win the queen. A simple but effective move. In this example, again, we see a very simple move, and it comes from the long-range effect of this rook pinning this g2 pawn to the king. What is the move when this pawn is actually immobilized? What that means is that its defense of the knight on h3 is nothing but an illusion, and the correct move is queen takes h3. White cannot recapture our queen because that pawn is pinned. In this position, it is white to move. One of the first things we should notice about this position is the alignment of the black king and the black queen on this same diagonal, and our ability to place a bishop on that diagonal, supported by one of our own pieces, to pin that queen to the king, and therefore we're going to win that queen. This position is again an example of how we're going to create a pin through violent means, and the way we're going to do that is as follows. Knight takes bishop. This forces the recapture of knight takes knight. And the question is, how do we now bring about a pin? And the answer is queen a3. This move pins the knight to the king. The knight can no longer move, and black has no way to actually add an extra defender to this piece. So after the next move, we will be free to take that knight, and we're now in an absolutely winning position. This example is similar, a little different, but similar. And it starts in the same way. We're going to play the violent move, knight takes bishop, forcing the king to recapture. Now, the correct answer is to play e4. We've got this pinned piece, pinned by our rook to the king. It cannot move. What do we want to do when we've pinned a piece? We want to concentrate force upon that piece. We want to kick it while it's down. Therefore, e4 is the correct move. After the king moves, we simply capture the knight and we're winning. In this position, we should note that the black king and queen are aligned on the same line, and through the cooperation of our queen and rook, we can place a rook on that same line, and thereby we're going to win the queen for the price of a rook. In this example, it's white to move. And what we should notice here is that the black king and rook are on the same diagonal. So we could institute a pin against this rook, and the way to do that is queen b4. This rook can now not move, and it's attacked once and twice, which means no matter what black does on the next move, let's say king e8, we will then win that rook and have an overwhelming material advantage with which we can win the whole game. Now, pins are not so simple. We saw an example earlier where we almost had a counter pin played against us, and we were just saved by the fact that we could jump our knight away with check. and that check bought us the amount of time we needed to save ourselves. Chess is a complex game. It's certainly not as easy as finding pieces on the same line and then pinning them. It's about making sure your opponent doesn't have some sort of counterattack as well, and in some of the remaining examples, we'll see further illustrations of that point. In this example, we see we're playing as black. White notices the alignment of our king and queen on the same line, and their ability to play rook e1, supported by their queen, pinning, and you would think winning our queen. But white's overlooked something here. What is it? White's overlooked bishop takes f2 check. With this move, an intermediate move inserted between the moves that white was expecting to be played, we force white to have to move again. Either they're going to have to play king h1 or king g2. In any case, we then take the rook. In this case, it's with another check. And if he had gone to h1, it would also be with another check, which would then force the queen trade. And after that, yes, both sides have a bishop, but we also have a rook. We're absolutely winning. And white's plan of pinning our queen has backfired because he didn't see that we had a resource of our own. Bishop f2 check, and then winning the rook. So you always have to be very careful. Here's another example. White was in a position like this, and they were attacking the knight here with the rook, and they played bishop g4, noting the alignment of these two pieces on this diagonal, and deciding to pin the piece as well as add extra pressure to the piece. So now if the knight moves, the queen will fall. But black has seen one extra move ahead and decides to play knight takes h4 anyway. White thinks that their strategy has worked, that they've pinned and now they're going to win the queen, so they take the queen. What they've missed is that from h4, the knight supports the bishop's attack of g2, which comes with check. And because there's another bishop here, which covers the g1 escape square, this is actually checkmate. Once again, white pins the knight, thinking that they're going to win a queen, but actually you have to be careful. Sometimes you might be able to sacrifice a queen, or your opponent could sacrifice a queen in order to deliver a checkmate. In this example, white is to move, and they note the alignment of the black knight and the black rook, and they think this knight is pinned. If it moves, then white is going to capture the rook here and win an exchange. So what does white do to this pinned piece, this immobilized piece? Well, white concentrates extra force against that piece by playing d4. However, how does black save his own game here? He can't move the knight away, but there is also the concept of a counter-attack. So what black does is he moves the rook to the c file where it attacks the bishop. So if you take my knight, I'm going to take your bishop, and everything is still hunky-dory. Here is yet another example of white thinking that they're going to pin black, but overlooking a resource that black has at their disposal. White plays this retreating move, rook d1, which attacks the black queen and very much encourages the black queen to take the knight. White does that because white notices that that will then align the black king and queen on the same diagonal, and that diagonal can then be occupied by the white bishop, supported by the white rook, enabling this pin, which white thinks is going to win the queen. What has white overlooked? White has overlooked that black can play c2 check, and also threatening to take the rook and get a new queen. Therefore, white has to retreat the bishop and take that very, very dangerous pawn. And all of a sudden, white actually managed to capture this knight that was here for the sake of this pawn, and black is the one that's doing better here. Here is yet another example, but this time it's definitely working for the team that goes for the pin. Black notices the alignment of the bishop and the queen, and notices that if this bishop moves, then the queen will fall. Therefore, this bishop is actually immobile. So black plays g5, adding extra concentration of force to the immobile piece and kicking it while it's down. But white does have a defensive idea, and that is queen g4. The purpose of this move is to pin the g5 pawn itself. This pawn now cannot take the bishop because it's pinned to its own king. A very ingenious defense. But black can actually continue the attack here, and the way that's done is by h5, further attacking the queen. Now, the queen takes the pawn, allowing our g5 pawn to take the white bishop. And the game goes on. Black has a big advantage, but it goes to show that the game is not a simple game, even once you know these basic weaponries like the pin. In this example, white is to move, and white notices the alignment of the black king and queen on this diagonal, and also notices that they can put the bishop on the diagonal, supported by this pawn, and pin the queen to the king. So it looks as though white is going to win this queen. But white has overlooked something very, very important. And that is that black has a pin of their own. Black is pinning this pawn to the white king. This pawn, therefore, and its defensive powers in particular, are illusory. And that means black can actually take on b3 with check and cannot be recaptured. Note that that pawn was the only thing that makes this bishop pin dangerous. With that pawn gone, this bishop's actually completely vulnerable. After the check, which white has to respond to, and he does that by king a2, black plays queen takes bishop. Now, white can capture the rook, it's true, but white is down a lot of material now, and black will have a checkmating attack. It goes like this: queen c2 check. Now this forces the king to come up to a3, and now queen b1. Queen b1 threatens to go here. This would be checkmate. So black needs to prevent us from getting here. And the way he does that is by retreating his own king to d2. Now if we come here, black will be able to block the check by sliding his queen across a few squares to a2. We don't want him to be able to bring his queen across to a2, so what we do is we play bishop c2, blocking its path. Now we are threatening this move, which again will be checkmate. So white is very much becoming helpless. White gives a useless check over here just to slow us down. We move the king, and now there is nothing better to do for white than to take our bishop, which we then recapture the queen. And white is now essentially useless. We bring our king very close to the white king and deliver the checkmate. But once again, the point of this move was to just say that just because these pieces are aligned and you think that you've got a pin that's going to win a piece like the queen, you always have to be careful that the other side doesn't have an amazing counter-attacking resource of their own. In this case, rook takes b3 check was a beautiful saving move. Not only saving, but winning, leading to a checkmating attack. In this position, White has noticed the alignment of the bishop and rook on the same file and has decided to add further pressure to that bishop by playing f4. However, White overlooked something. White overlooked that the bishop can move away with check, and that check forces White to move the king, and that buys enough time for Black that not only have they moved the bishop away, but now they've uncovered an attack on the rook, and they're going to win the rook, and now they're going to win the game. Similarly, in this position, White has pinned the black knight to the black rook, and has decided to increase the pressure against that knight by playing rook d2. Now there are two attackers against the knight, and if the knight moves, for example here, this rook falls. What did White miss? White missed that by leaving the back rank undefended and allowing the knight to come here where it actually protects the b1 square, Black can put a rook on b1 and deliver checkmate. So similar to before, where we saw a knight jump away in order to sacrifice a queen such that they could deliver checkmate, here we see the knight jump away such that they can sacrifice a rook and deliver checkmate. So pinning is not enough to win. You also have to do it carefully in the context of the broader position. In this position, White is attacking the black knight, and this is a relatively simple position. As Black, we notice that the black king and queen are aligned on the same line, and that we have both the knight and the queen defending the c5 square from which our bishop can provide a beautiful pin. There is really nothing White can do in terms of counterattack, so we simply win the queen for a bishop, and the game will go on from here. Yes, we will lose the knight, but we've won a queen for a bishop, so that's not too bad at all. In fact, it's excellent. In this position, White's noticed the alignment of our knight and queen and has attacked that knight several times. But there is a saving move for us. That saving move is that we can move our knight away to capture this knight. And now, even if the bishop takes our queen, our knight will jump back and take the white queen. So that resource exists. And it's for that reason that we can actually take this knight. Now, let's say White decides not to take our queen, but instead just takes our knight and maintains the attack on our queen. Well, we don't actually have to move this queen. We can continue our development by playing knight c6. And again, if they take our queen, we're going to take their queen. And if they move their queen away, which still allows their attack to continue on our queen then moves away, and we've got a double attack happening, or two pieces attacking the e5 pawn, and we've managed to escape from the grips of what was a very scary situation with our knight apparently pinned and attacked multiple times. We managed to, in a very agile manner, unfurl ourselves from that scenario. That concludes the chapter on pins. To summarize, you should be looking for pins at any point in time when you notice pieces of your opponent on the same line or diagonal. Once you have a pin, which you might have to bring about through creative means, you always looking for violent moves as those means by which to bring about a pin. Once you have a pin, the way to exploit the pin is by very carefully deciding about how you can add pressure to the pinned piece, concentrating force on the immobile piece, and kicking that piece while it's down. That is the methodical thinking behind pins, which is the first of the weapons we've learned about in this book. Up next, we will learn about the knight fork.